I am going to tell you what happened on the dredge, and I am going to tell you straight, because there is nobody left who worked that contract with me who can correct the parts I get wrong. I am the last one whose phone still rings. My name does not matter. What matters is that I was 46 years old that summer, and I'd been a hydraulic dredge operator for 22 of those years, working mostly the inland routes, harbors and channels, and the occasional reservoir cleanup. And I had taken the offshore contract because my brother had died in March, and the work at home reminded me of him in ways I could not stand to be reminded. He had been a diver. Commercial, not recreational. He had worked the same kinds of jobs I had worked on the surface side for most of his life. And in February, he had gone down on a pipeline inspection off a coast I am not going to name, and he had not come back up. The company called it an equipment failure. The autopsy called it drowning. My mother called it the thing she had been waiting 40 years to be told. I called it nothing, because I did not have a word for it. And I took the offshore job because it was the furthest from his grave I could legally go. The contract was a maintenance dredge on a working anchorage, about 11 nautical miles off a stretch of coastline that catches a lot of weather and not much else. The bay there has been silting up for 30 years because of a river upstream that nobody wants to pay to fix. And every few years, the Port Authority hires out a dredge company to come in and pull the bottom back down to draft, so the shallow draft cargo ships can keep using the anchorage to wait out the bigger lines at the main port up the coast. The vessel I worked on was a cutter suction dredge, about 240 feet long, with a forward boom that lowered a rotating cutter head onto the seabed and a slurry pipe that ran along a series of floating pontoons to a spoil barge anchored about a mile off our position. It was a 5-man crew with 2 rotating watches, 12 hours on and 12 off, 28 days on the water and 14 days ashore. I had signed on for 2 rotations, 8 weeks of work in exchange for not having to look at my brother's empty house. The captain was a man named Halvers, mid-50s, who had run dredges off 3 different continents and who spoke to me like a colleague rather than an employee from the first day, which I appreciated because I'd been on enough boats to know the difference. The first mate was a younger man named Doust, early 30s, ambitious in the quiet way that meant he was going to have his own boat in a few years, and we all knew it. Our engineer was an old Finn named Antero, who barely spoke but who could rebuild a hydraulic pump with his eyes closed, and our deckhand was a kid out of a maritime academy named Pell, 22, on his first real contract, who called me sir until I made him stop. I was the dredge operator. I sat in the cabin on the boom side, watched the screens, ran the cutter, monitored the slurry pressure, and kept the head from digging into anything it should not. That was my job. The screens were the part of the job that meant the most to me. The cutter head fed a forward-facing sonar package that gave me a real-time picture of the bottom in front of the cutter, layered with the side scan from the hull units and the multi-beam from the survey pod. We ran in a small grid over the work area twice a day. I could see the contour of the seabed in pale green and yellow on a wide display, with the cutter's position marked in red, and a depth readout running along the bottom. I could see the soft layer of silt we were there to remove, sitting on top of the harder clay below it. And if I looked closely, I could see the small irregularities in the clay, the places where old anchors had dragged, the long, shallow channel where a pipeline ran past our work area, the slight rise where a rock outcrop sat off our southern edge. The screens were the language of the job. I trusted them the way you trust the dashboard of a car. I had been reading screens like that for 2 decades, and I had never been wrong about what they showed me, because the screens had never tried to show me anything they did not mean. The first 3 weeks of the contract were ordinary. The weather was kind for the season. The cutter ran smoothly. The slurry pressure stayed in range. The spoil barge filled on schedule and was tugged off to the disposal site by a small support vessel that came out from the mainland twice a week. We took our meals together in the mess. Halvers ran a tight boat, but a humane one. Pell turned out to be funny once he relaxed. Antero turned out to drink coffee at a volume that would have killed a smaller man. Doust kept his own counsel, but laughed at the right things. I slept hard during my off watches, and I thought about my brother only in the half hour after I woke up, which was an improvement over how I'd been at home. What I want to tell you about started on a Thursday in the middle of the 4th week. I remember it was a Thursday because Thursday was when the supply boat came out. And I was on the afterdeck having a cup of coffee in the late afternoon and watching the supply skipper unload our resupply onto the transfer crane. The sea was flat, almost glassy. The light was the heavy gold color that the late sun gets when the air is dry and there is no haze. The supply skipper was a man I had spoken to maybe 3 times. He was a local. He had grown up in the small port town we staged out of, and he had been running supply runs for the dredge company on and off for about 10 years. His name was Mayor, short for something I never asked about, and he was the kind of man who did not waste words. He finished his unload, and he came up onto our deck for the coffee that was traditional. He sat down across from me. He looked tired, which was not unusual. But he also looked at me in a way that I did not like, which was. He drank his coffee for a while without speaking. Then he said, "You boys are working the south end this week." I said we were. He said, "The south end of this anchorage." I said yes. He took another swallow of coffee. He said, "My grandfather used to fish this bay before they ran the lines through here." He said his grandfather had told him, when he was a boy, that there were parts of the bottom out here that you did not work over. He said his grandfather had been very clear about which parts. He said his grandfather had told him a great many things about the ocean floor that he had not believed at the time and that he had come to believe, slowly, over the course of his own working life. In the way that a man comes to believe things he was warned about by people who are no longer around to be thanked. I drank my coffee. I waited for him to make a point. He did not make one in a hurry. He said, "The south end of this anchorage is one of the places he told me about." I said, "Told you what about it?" He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "That you do not stir the bottom there." He said it in the tone of a man repeating a sentence he had heard so many times in his childhood that the words had worn smooth. He said his grandfather had used a word for it in the local dialect that did not translate cleanly into English. The closest he could get, he said, was that the bottom there was not finished settling. He said that was not the right word, but it was the word he had. He said he had told the port authority about it twice, in his way. And they had thanked him for his concern, and they had filed his concern wherever they filed such things. And the work had been scheduled anyway. I asked him if he was telling me to refuse to dredge that section. He said no. He said he was not telling me anything. He said he was drinking his coffee. He said he had told me what his grandfather had told him because he had been raised to tell people such things when the situation arose. And now he had told me, and his obligation was finished, and he hoped I had a good rest of the rotation. He stood up. He shook my hand. He went back down to his boat. He cast off. He pulled away. I watched his wake. I held my coffee. I thought about it for about a minute. Then I went back inside. I am telling you this part in full because I want you to understand that I was warned. I was warned by a man who had no reason to warn me, who gained nothing by warning me, who had clearly been raised in a tradition that took warning seriously enough that he had performed his small ceremony of it across a coffee cup on the deck of a working vessel, because that was the only opportunity he was going to get. I was warned. And I did not refuse the work. And I did not bring it to Halver's. And I did not write it in the log. I went back into the cabin, and I sat down at the screens, and I started my next watch. I told myself then that I had not brought it to Halver's because Halver's would have laughed. That was true. Halver's would have laughed, and he would have noted it in his head as a thing I had said. And he would not have respected me quite the same way for the rest of the contract. And I had wanted the respect. I told myself that I had not refused the work because refusing the work would have meant breaking the contract. And breaking the contract would have meant going home, and going home would have meant my brother's empty house. That was also true. I told myself a number of true things in the days afterward, and what I could not tell myself, because I did not believe it yet, was the truest thing, which was that the supply skipper had given me a chance to be a man who took an old warning seriously, and I had decided to be a man who did not. The first anomaly came 2 nights later. It was during my night watch. We ran the dredge 24 hours a day when the weather allowed. The cutter was working a long lane on the south edge of the anchorage, where the silt sat thickest, and I was alone in the cabin with the screens and a fresh thermos, and the radio turned down low. The work was slow and steady. The cutter head ground its way along the bottom at a pace you could measure with your eye. The slurry pressure held. The pumps below me hummed their constant hum. At about 2 in the morning, the forward sonar started to show something I had not seen before. The bottom in our work area was, on a normal night, a layered picture. The silt layer on top, the clay layer below, the occasional old object embedded in either layer, the slope of the seabed sliding gently downward to the south. I had spent enough hours staring at that picture that I could have drawn it from memory. What I started seeing that night was the slope drifting north. Not the bottom, the slope. The contour line where the seabed began to fall off into deeper water, which on the chart sat a steady half-mile south of our work lane, had moved. Not a lot, a few meters. I noticed it because I had memorized where it was supposed to be relative to our cutter's position, and it was no longer where it was supposed to be. I checked the GPS on the vessel. The GPS said we were where we had been. I checked the heading. The heading was correct. I checked the readings from the multi-beam pod, which we had not run for 2 days, because the survey was on a Tuesday-Friday schedule. The last multi-beam picture, from Friday morning, showed the slope where it had always been. The forward sonar tonight, Sunday night, showed the slope a few meters closer. I sat with that for a while. I told myself a few things. I told myself the forward sonar package had a wider error margin than the multi-beam, and that the difference was probably within tolerance. I told myself we had been working the silt layer hard, and that the silt could shift under the cutter's wash, and that a few meters of apparent contour drift over 48 hours of active dredging was not impossible. I told myself I would mention it to Deuced in the morning and have him run the multi-beam early and see what the survey said. I did not write it in the log either. This is the part that I would like to explain to you cleanly and cannot. I had been warned, and I had seen the first thing the warning had warned me about, and I still did not write it down. I will tell you what I tell myself. I tell myself that I was tired. I tell myself that the difference was small enough that an honest professional could choose either way. I tell myself that I was waiting for the multi-beam to confirm before I made noise. All of those are true, and none of them are the reason. The reason is that I had decided, sometime between the supply skipper finishing his coffee and that Sunday night, that the warning was the kind of thing that a man like me did not act on. And I was going to be the man I had decided to be, and the screens were going to have to work harder than that to talk me out of it. In the morning, I told Deuced we should run the multi-beam early. He said sure, no problem. He had been about to suggest the same thing because he had noticed the cutter feedback was running a little soft on the south edge, and he wanted to check the contour. He ran it at 8. The picture came in clean. The slope sat where it always sat. The contour was within a meter of the Friday survey. Whatever I had seen on the forward sonar at 2 in the morning had either corrected itself or had been a glitch. I looked at Doust, looking at the screen. And I looked at the screen. And I thought, that is that, I thought. The screens lied to me for an hour at 2 in the morning, and then they corrected themselves, and the system is working, and I can let this go. That afternoon, Pell came up to the cabin with a sandwich for me. He stood for a while, watching me work. He asked me what the cutter was doing. I told him. He asked me about the depth readout. I told him about the depth readout. He asked me, eventually, in the way that a young man asks something he has been working up to, whether I had seen the thing on the deck the night before. I had not been on the deck the night before. I had been in the cabin. I asked him what he meant. He said he had been having a cigarette on the port rail, the one facing south, at about 2 in the morning, because he had been off watch and could not sleep. He said the moon had been out, 3/4, and the sea had been flat the way it had been for days. He said he had been looking out at the water, just looking, the way you do. And he had seen something on the surface about 100 yards off our beam. He said he had thought at first it was a piece of debris from our cutter wash. Then he had thought it was a whale. Then he had realized he did not know what it was. He said it had been long and dark and not moving much, and it had not had the shape of any animal he knew. And after about a minute, it had gone back under. I asked him if he had told Halvers. He said no. He said he had not been sure of what he had seen, and he had not wanted to look like a kid on his first contract who jumped at things. He had told me, he said, because I'd been on the cabin watch at the time, and he wanted to know if I had seen anything on the screens. I told him I had not. I did not tell him about the contour drift. I told him it had probably been a sunfish or a basking shark, or a piece of dunnage that had drifted out of one of the anchorage's traffic lanes. I told him sunfish could be 8 or 10 feet long and looked like nothing when they were lying flat on the surface. I told him to mention it to Halvers anyway, just so it was in the log, in case anyone reported a debris hazard. He nodded. He looked relieved. He took his sandwich plate and he went back down. I do not know if he ever told Halvers. I never asked. He was 22 and I was 46, and I had told him it was probably a sunfish. And that was probably enough for him to file it away. That evening at dinner, Halvers asked me how the south lane was running. I said it was running fine. I said the cutter feedback had been a little soft in the morning, but that the multi-beam had come in clean. I said we would probably finish the south lane by Wednesday and shift to the east one. He nodded. He drank his tea. Antero said something about the slurry pump bearings needing a service in the next port call. Doust said something about the resupply order. Pell ate his food and listened. It was an ordinary dinner. There was no part of it where I could have said, by the way, the supply skipper warned me about this section of bottom. And I saw the contour drift on the forward sonar at 2 this morning. And Pell saw something long and dark in the moonlight off our beam. There was no part of any of our dinners where a sentence like that would have fit. That was the shape of the boat. That was the shape I had agreed to. The second anomaly came on Tuesday morning, on the scheduled multi-beam survey. Doust ran the survey at 7, the way he always did. The picture came in. The picture was wrong. I want to describe this carefully because the wrongness was not dramatic. It was not a feature you would have noticed if you were not looking for it. The slope at the south edge of the work area, the one I had thought had drifted on Sunday night. was where it should be. The work lane itself was clean, freshly cut, the silt removed down to the clay the way we had cut it. The contour was within tolerance everywhere I checked. What was wrong was the texture of the clay in the work lane. The clay we had been cutting was the ordinary marine clay you got on this stretch of coast. Gray-blue, dense, slightly silty, with the kind of fine ripple pattern that a multi-beam picks up as a soft modeling on the screen. I had been looking at that modeling for almost 4 weeks. I knew what it looked like. The clay in the work lane on Tuesday morning had a different modeling. It was finer and more regular. It looked, on the screen, the way a piece of fabric looks when it has been folded and then smoothed out. The pattern ran in long, even bands along the lane. Doust noticed it before I did. He said, "That's funny." He zoomed in. The bands stayed bands. He scrolled along the lane. The bands ran the whole length of what we had cut on Sunday and Monday. He said, "Did you change the cutter angle?" I said I had not. He said, "Well, something cut these in." He said it casually, the way an engineer says a thing he has not yet decided to worry about. He saved the survey. He said he would compare it to the Friday one in the afternoon. He went off to do something else. I sat at the screen for a long time after he left. I scrolled along the lane. The bands ran the whole length of it. They were too regular to be a cutter artifact. They were too fine to be a wash pattern from the slurry. They looked like grooves. They looked like the marks you get on a beach when the tide goes out and the sand has been raked by something that was not a person. I told myself the clay had a natural grain. I told myself the multi-beam was reading the same clay in a slightly different way because the cutter had exposed a deeper layer. I told myself I would wait until Doust did his comparison. I made myself a fresh cup of coffee. I went back to running the cutter. That afternoon, Doust came up to the cabin. He had the 2 surveys side by side on a laptop. He showed me. The Friday survey of the work lane, before we had cut it, showed the ordinary modeling I knew. The Tuesday survey of the work lane, after we had cut it, showed the bands. He said he could not account for it. He said he had run the multi-beam through the diagnostic and the diagnostic was clean. He said he was going to send the 2 surveys to the company office at the next data uplink and ask them what they thought. I asked him if he had told Halvers. He said yes, he had told Halvers. Halvers had looked at the bands for about 30 seconds and had said it was probably a stratification artifact, that the cutter had exposed a layer of clay with a different sedimentary structure underneath, and that we should keep going. Halvers had said the company would not appreciate us stopping work to investigate a modeling pattern on a survey screen. He had said it nicely, but he had said it. Doust said this last part to me with a slight, very careful expression. He was telling me what Halvers had said, and he was also telling me what he thought about what Halvers had said, without quite telling me what he thought. I had known Doust for 4 weeks. I knew the expression. He thought Halvers was wrong. He was not going to push. I told him he should send the surveys to the company anyway. He said he was going to. He went back down. That night, on my watch, I started running the forward sonar in a higher resolution mode than I usually use during a cut. It cost me a little processing speed and a little battery on the unit, but it gave me a finer picture of the seabed under the cutter. I told myself I was doing it because of the bands. I told myself I was doing it because I wanted to be a careful operator. I was doing it because I wanted to see what would happen at 2 in the morning. At 2 in the morning, the slope to the south moved again. This time, I watched it happen. I had the screen up at a wider view than usual, the full work area and the slope to the south of it. The cutter was working its lane in the foreground. The slope sat in the background, on the bottom edge of the screen, where the contour fell off into deeper water. I had been watching it for an hour and a half without taking my eyes off it for more than a few seconds at a time. At 1:58, the slope was where it had been. At 2:03, the slope was about 2 meters closer to our work area. It did not slide. It did not creep. There was no animation of movement on the screen. The contour was where it was. And then a few minutes later, the contour was somewhere else, a little nearer. And the picture in between had been the picture of a slope sitting still. The screen had not glitched. The numbers along the bottom of the display had run smoothly. The cutter position had stayed steady. The GPS had been correct. Everything else on the screen had behaved exactly the way it always behaved. The slope had moved. I sat with my hands on the console, and I did not touch anything. I watched the slope for the next hour. It did not move again. It sat at its new position. The contour line on the screen ran where it now ran. If I had not been watching when it had changed, I would have looked at the screen at 3 in the morning and thought, the slope is a little closer than I remembered. And I would have blamed my memory, and I would have moved on. I picked up the radio handset on the console. I held it. I thought about calling Halvers up to the cabin. I thought about what I would say. I thought about saying, the slope moved. And I thought about Halvers's face. I thought about Halvers saying it was probably a sensor calibration issue, and going back to his bunk. I thought about Halvers being annoyed at having been woken up. I thought about the fact that I had not written down the supply skipper's warning, and that I had not written down the Sunday night drift, and that I had told Pell it was probably a sunfish. I thought about the fact that I had a record, by this point, of not saying the things I was now thinking about saying. I put the handset down. I want to tell you what I felt then. I do not have a clean word for it. It was not fear exactly. It was the feeling of a man who has been standing on a floor for a long time and has just understood that the floor is not what he thought it was, and who has also understood that he has been the one telling everyone else the floor is fine. I had told Pell it was a sunfish. I had told Deuced that the multi-beam would probably clear up the contour drift. I had told Halvers at dinner that the south lane was running fine. I had been, for 3 days, the man on the boat who was deciding what the screens meant. And I had been deciding wrong, and other people on the boat had been making their own decisions on the basis of mine. I stayed at the console for the rest of my watch. I did not call anyone up. I did not write anything in the log. At 6 in the morning, Dost came up to relieve me. He looked at my face and asked me if I had slept. I said I had not. I said the cutter was running fine, the slurry pressure had held, and the south lane was about 60% complete. I did not mention the slope. I went down to my bunk and I lay on it, with my eyes open until the breakfast bell rang. At breakfast, I made my decision. I had been deciding it all night, without admitting I was deciding it. I was going to wait until the next multi-beam survey on Friday. If the Friday survey showed the slope where it had been on Tuesday, I would say nothing. And I would let the contract finish, and I would go home. And I would never take an offshore job again. If the Friday survey showed the slope closer to our work area than it had been on Tuesday, I would tell Halvers everything. I told myself this was a reasonable plan. I told myself that I was not panicking, that I was gathering data, that a good operator did not act on a single sensor anomaly during a night watch. I told myself that 2 more days was nothing. The boat was running fine. The crew was safe. The cutter was cutting. Nothing was going to happen in 2 days that could not be handled. I want to be very honest with you here. The plan I made over breakfast was not a plan to be careful. It was a plan to not have to be the man who had to say anything yet. I was buying myself 2 days of not having to talk to Halvers about a supply skipper's grandfather. That is what the plan was. On Wednesday afternoon, the support vessel came out with the next data uplink and a small parcel of mail. There was a letter for me in the parcel. It was from my brother's wife. She had handwritten it, which she did not normally do. She wrote that she was sorting through his things and that she had found a small notebook he had kept in his dive bag, one she had not known about, in which he had written down certain jobs and certain things he had seen on those jobs that he had not told the company about. She wrote that she had read it through twice and that she did not understand most of it, because most of it was technical, but that there was a page near the back that had my name on it. She had photocopied the page and folded it into the letter. The page was in his handwriting. It was dated about 6 months before he died. It was a list, in his small, precise diver's print, of things he had been told by other divers about certain stretches of bottom on a number of jobs he had worked. Most of the entries were 2 or 3 lines long. The last entry was longer. It read, "Told to me by L. The bottom in some places does not like to be cut. He says he has heard from older men that there are areas where the seabed has been left alone for a reason, and that the modern surveys do not show the reason because the reason does not show up on sonar in a normal way. He says if you ever work a cutter or a clamshell on a bottom that has been left alone, you may notice that the slope nearby seems to move. He says the slope is not moving. He says the slope is the same. What is moving is the part of the bottom you cannot see on the screen. He says if you see the slope move, you are already inside the part that is moving. And you should stop working immediately, and you should not anchor in the area again. And you should not return to the area in the same boat. And you should not go in the water for any reason within a mile of that position." He says he was told this by a man who had been told it by his father, who had been told it by his father. And he says he believes it because he saw it happen once, and because the people who did not stop did not come back the same. Below that, in my brother's handwriting, was a note that read, "Ask my brother if he has ever heard of this on the inland routes." He may have. He sees more bottom than I do. She had written underneath on the photocopy in her own handwriting, "I do not know if this is the kind of thing you wanted to know, but it had your name on it, and I thought you should have it. I'm sorry I did not send it sooner. I have been slow with his things. I hope you are well out there." I read the page in my bunk. I read it again. I read it a 3rd time. I held the photocopy in my hands for a long time. I thought about my brother sitting in some galley somewhere, writing that down in his small, precise print. I thought about him meaning to ask me about it. I thought about him meaning to ask me about it, and then not asking me about it, the way he had not asked me about a great many things over the years. Because we had been brothers in the way that working men are sometimes brothers, which is to say we had loved each other across a distance. Neither of us had known how to close. I thought about the fact that he had written my name down in a notebook in his dive bag 6 months before he had drowned on a pipeline inspection on a coast I was not going to name. I thought about the fact that the page had reached me on the 4th day after I had watched the slope move on a screen at 2 a.m, on a south anchorage where a supply skipper's grandfather had warned me not to stir the bottom. I folded the photocopy and I put it in the inside pocket of my work jacket. I went up to the cabin. Doust was on watch. I told him I needed to talk to Halvers. He asked me if it was something he should know about. I said I would tell him after. I went to find Halvers. I did not find him in the wheelhouse. I did not find him in his cabin. I went down to the engine room. Antero was there alone, working on a pump, with the radio on his belt and a rag in his back pocket. I asked him where Halvers was. Antero looked up at me. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, in his slow, careful English, that the captain had taken the small launch about an hour ago. I asked him where. Antero said the captain had not told him where. Antero said the captain had taken the launch and a handheld radio in a small bag and had said he would be back before dark. Antero said this in the tone of a man who has worked with captains long enough to know that captains sometimes do this, and that it is not his place to ask. Antero said he had assumed the captain was going to meet the supply vessel, which was due that afternoon. Antero said he had checked the radio for any traffic from the supply vessel, and there had been none. Antero said he had been about to come up and ask me if I knew what the captain was doing. I told him I did not know. I went back up to the deck. The afternoon light was the same heavy gold it had been on the day the supply skipper had told me about his grandfather. The sea was almost flat. I went to the port rail and I looked out across it. The small launch was not at the rail. The small launch was not in the water within sight of the vessel. The horizon to the south, where the slope on the screen had been moving toward us for 4 days, was empty. There was no boat on it. There was no wake. There was no sound except the constant low hum of our pumps and the slow grind of the cutter on the bottom 190 feet below us. I felt the photocopy in the inside pocket of my work jacket. I felt it the way you feel a thing you have not yet read out loud to anyone. I stood at the rail, and I looked at the empty water. And I understood finally that whatever I had been buying 2 days of silence to avoid was not going to wait 2 days. And that the man I had decided to be on the day the supply skipper finished his coffee was about to be tested in a way I had no plan for. And that the captain of the vessel I was standing on had, for reasons of his own, gotten into a small boat alone that afternoon and gone somewhere he had not told his crew about, and that the south horizon was the only direction his wake could have gone, and that the cutter below me, on the bottom I'd been told not to stir, was still cutting. I went back down to the engine room, and I told Antero that I needed him to come up to the bridge with me. He did not ask why. He set his wrench down on the rag, wiped his hands, and followed me up the ladder. On the way, I stopped at the cabin and told Dost to come too. He looked at me and saw whatever was in my face, and did not ask anything either. He left the cutter running on the auto hold the way you do when the cutter is in soft material and you trust it for 10 minutes. The three of us went up to the wheelhouse together. I closed the door behind us. I took the photocopy out of my jacket. I laid it on the chart table. I told them about the supply skipper's grandfather. I told them about the contour drift on Sunday night and how I had not written it down. I told them about Pell's long dark shape in the moonlight and how I had told him it was a sunfish. I told them about the bands in the clay on the Tuesday survey. I told them about watching the slope move while I had the radio handset in my hand and not picking it up. I told them my brother had been a diver. I told them he was dead. I read the page in his handwriting out loud, slowly, in the quiet of the wheelhouse, with the cutter grinding the bottom under our feet. When I was done, Dost looked at the photocopy for a long time. He picked it up. He read the long entry himself, moving his lips a little the way he did when he was concentrating. He set it back down. He said, "All right." He said it the way he said things at the end of a difficult conversation he was going to act on. He said, "We are stopping the cutter." He said, "We are picking up the head. We are stowing the boom. We are coming off this position. And we are going to the deep water anchorage on the north side of the bay until we can talk to the company and the port authority and decide what to do next." Antero nodded once. Dost said, "Where is the captain?" I told him what Antero had told me about the launch. Dost closed his eyes for a second. Then he opened them. He said, "All right, He said the captain had taken the launch, and that was the captain's choice. He said we would raise him on the radio and tell him what we were doing, and he could come find us at the North Anchorage when he was ready. He said the boat was not going to keep cutting that bottom while its master was off it. He said it as a thing of seamanship rather than as a thing of fear, which I think was the only way he could say it out loud. Antero said, "The launch radio." He said it slowly, the way he said most things. He said the captain had taken the handheld, and that the handheld was a short-range unit, not the long-range set in the launch's console. He said the captain had not turned on the console set when he had cast off, because Antero had been on the afterdeck and had watched him go, and would have heard the console set come up if it had. He said the captain would not have raised the launch's main radio if he had been going to meet the supply boat, because the supply boat would have called us first. He said the captain had been quiet about leaving. He said this with no expression in his face, but I had worked next to him for 4 weeks by then, and I knew the lack of expression was the expression. Deuced said we would call the captain on the handheld channel first and the company on the satellite second. He said he was going to go down and tell Pell. He said Pell should know what was happening. He went out. Antero and I stood in the wheelhouse for a moment without speaking. Antero said quietly, "You should have come to me on Sunday." I said I knew. He said, "The old men in my country used to say things too." I said I knew that as well. He went out after doused. I stayed in the wheelhouse alone. I called the captain on the handheld channel. There was no answer. I called him again. There was no answer. I called him a third time, and I said his name into the dead air, and I waited. The channel hissed. Nothing came back. I switched the radio to the standby channel that the supply boat used. I called the supply skipper. I called him by his name, Mayor, twice. After a long pause, he came on. His voice was the same flat, tired voice it had been on the deck the day he had told me about his grandfather. I asked him if he was anywhere near our position. He said he was about 3 hours out, inbound for a scheduled drop on Friday, but he could come earlier if I needed him to. I said I might. I said our captain had taken the launch and was not answering. There was a silence on his end that lasted long enough that I thought I had lost the connection. Then he said, "When did he leave?" I told him, about an hour and a half ago, southbound by the look of it. No transit plan filed with anyone on board. He said, "I'm coming now." He cut the connection. I sat in the wheelhouse with the handset in my hand for a moment. Then I went down to the cabin. Doust was already shutting the cutter down. He had the boom controls in his hands and was bringing the head up, Dalraman off the bottom in a careful, slow lift. Pell was standing in the doorway of the cabin behind him, very pale, listening. Antero had gone back to the engine room to bring the pumps down. The slurry pressure was bleeding off on the gauge. The hum under our feet was changing pitch as the system depressurized. The screens in front of Doust still showed the work area. I sat down at the second seat and I looked at the forward sonar. The slope had moved again. It was about 15 meters closer than it had been on my watch the night before. The contour line on the screen ran where it now ran. The cutter was lifting up out of the lane we had cut. The lane was a clean cut, the bands of fabric-like mottling running along its length. And the slope to the south of it was no longer where the charts said it was supposed to be. The slope was inside our work area now, or the work area was inside the slope. I could not tell which anymore, and I do not think it mattered. Doust looked at the screen. He saw what I was seeing. He said, "All right." He said it again. He kept the boom lifting. The cutter head came up out of the bottom. The slurry pipe stopped passing material. The pumps wound down. Pell said, "What is that?" He said it in the small voice of a young man who does not yet have a working version of the question he is trying to ask. I said, That is what I should have told you about on Monday. He did not understand. He did not need to understand yet. Dost said to him, Pell, go down and help Antero secure the engine room for a shift. We are pulling up and going to the North Anchorage. He said it the way Halvers would have said it, in the routine voice of a working order. And Pell, 22 and on his first contract, did what he was told and went down. Doust watched him go. Then he looked at me. He said, You should have written it down. I said I knew. He said, If you had written it down on Sunday, I would have run the multi-beam Sunday afternoon, and we would have seen it then. I said I knew that too. He did not say anything else about it. He turned back to the boom controls. He kept the lift going. The cutter head was about 30 feet off the bottom now. The screen showed it rising slowly toward the boom. He said, When the head is stowed, I'm going to start the bow thrusters and walk us off this position northbound. The pontoons can stay on the slurry line for now. We will retrieve them once we are clear. I said I would handle the radio. I went back up to the wheelhouse. I called the company on the satellite phone. I got the night duty officer, a man whose voice I did not recognize. I told him our captain was missing in the launch, that we were leaving the South Anchorage on the first mate's authority, that we had a sonar anomaly we could not account for, and that the supply boat was inbound to assist. The duty officer asked me to repeat all of it. I repeated all of it. He asked me what kind of sonar anomaly. I told him the slope was moving on the forward sonar and that the multi-beam was showing patterns in the clay that we could not explain. He was quiet for a moment. He asked me if I had been drinking. I said I had not. He said he would call the company's marine ops director and have him call us back. He said in the meantime, we should do whatever the first mate thought was prudent. He said this in a voice that was already preparing a paper trail. I thanked him. I hung up. I called the port authority on the secondary channel. I told a watchstander what was happening. He took down the captain's name and the launch's identification number and said he would issue an advisory. He asked me for a position. I gave him the position. He said the search and rescue rotation for our sector was a Coast Guard cutter about 90 nautical miles north of us that was responding to a fishing vessel in distress and would not be available for several hours. He said there was a smaller patrol boat about 40 miles east that could be diverted. He said he would divert it. I came back down to the cabin. Doust had the head stowed. The boom was in its travel cradle. The pumps were idling. He was standing at the engine telegraph. He said, "We go now." He pushed the telegraph forward. The bow thrusters came on. The vessel began to crab sideways off the work position, the slurry pontoons trailing behind us in a long curve. The pontoons would have to be retrieved by a tug later. Doust did not care. He wanted us off that bottom. The vessel was moving at about 1.5 knots when the screens changed. I want to describe this carefully. I had been watching the forward sonar because I could not stop watching it. The cutter was up. The boom was stowed. The forward sonar was now showing me the bottom under the bow of the vessel in transit mode, with the cutter outline removed from the display. The slope to the south, which had been creeping toward our work area for 4 days, did the thing it had done at 2 on Monday morning, but this time it did it in a different way. It came up. The contour line on the screen, which had been running across the lower part of the display, lifted. The slope did not move horizontally. The slope rose. The depth readings along the southern half of the screen began to climb. They climbed slowly. The slope on the screen was now shallower than it had been a minute earlier. It was still climbing. Doust saw it too. He stood at the telegraph and watched the screen rise. The bow thrusters held. The vessel kept its slow, sideways walk northward. The slope kept rising. The depth readout for the seabed below our hull, which had been steady at 192 feet, began to drop. It went to 180. It went to 170. It went to 150. There was no shock. There was no rumble. There was no sound. The hull did not feel anything. The water around us was still flat. The horizon was still empty. The pumps were still humming at idle. The screen was still showing me numbers that were going down at a rate of about 10 feet a minute. Doust said very quietly, "That is not possible." I said no. He pushed the telegraph harder. The bow thrusters strained. The vessel began to walk northward faster, maybe 2.5 knots. The seabed under us kept rising. 120 feet, 180. I picked up the radio and I called Mayor on the supply channel. He came on instantly. I told him what was happening. I told him in the simplest words I could find. The bottom is coming up under us. We are walking north. We need you faster. He did not ask me to repeat any of it. He said he was 40 minutes out and he was running hard. He said he was going to call the patrol boat and tell them to bring everything they had. He cut off. The depth under our hull went to 60, 40. Doust stopped the bow thrusters. He said, "We cannot run aground out here." He said it as a fact rather than a decision. He said the vessel drew 19 feet and that the sand and silt at this depth on a normal seabed was not the kind of sand and silt you wanted to settle into with a dredge hull. He killed the thrust. He let us drift. The bottom kept coming up. 30 feet, 20. It stopped at 14. The depth gauge held at 14 feet under our keel. The vessel sat there. The water around us was flat. The horizon was still empty. We were now, according to the screen, sitting in 14 feet of water in a place where the chart said the seabed was nearly 200 feet down. Nothing about the surface of the sea had changed. There were no swells. There was no current. There was no movement on the deck. The sun was the same gold late afternoon sun. The radio was hissing softly on the standby channel. Doust said, "Look at the side scan." I looked. The side scan, which painted a picture of the seabed to either side of our hull, was showing something I'd never seen on any screen in my career. Around us, in a rough circle that extended out about 100 meters in every direction, the seabed at the new shallow depth had the same fabric-like mottling we had seen in the work lane. The bands ran in long, even arcs, concentric, with our hull at their center. Outside the circle, beyond the 100 meters, the seabed dropped away again to its proper depth, the contour falling off toward the south where the slope had originally been. We were sitting on a raised platform that had not existed an hour ago. The platform was not natural. The platform had the texture of something that had been pulled up, deliberately, into a shape that held us where we were. Doust did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Get Pell up here." I went down. Pell was on the afterdeck with Antero, who had finished securing the engine room and was watching the water. Antero looked at me as I came down the ladder. He had seen the depth gauge in the engine room, which was a repeater of the bridge gauge. He knew what was under us. He did not say anything. Pell came up to the cabin with me. Doust showed him the side scan. He showed him the depth gauge. He told him, in plain words, that we were sitting on something that was not the seabed, and that we did not know what it was, and that we needed to be ready to leave the vessel quickly if the situation changed. Pell took this with the calm that you sometimes get from a young man on his first contract when the older men around him are not panicking, which is one of the reasons we did not panic. We had a job. The job now was getting him off this boat alive. The captain came back at dusk. I want to describe what I saw because I've not been able to stop seeing it. The launch came in from the south. The light was almost gone. The launch was riding low in the water. It was riding much lower than a launch with one man and a small bag in it should have been riding. I went out to the port rail when I saw it on the radar, because the radar had picked it up at about a half-mile out, and I wanted to see it coming. Antero came out and stood next to me without speaking. Dost stayed in the wheelhouse on the radio with Mare. Pell was below. The launch came up alongside our boarding ladder at very slow speed. I could see Halvers at the wheel. He looked the way he had looked at breakfast, in his blue work shirt and his ball cap, his hands on the controls, in the way that captains hold controls. He did not look hurt. He did not look frightened. He came alongside, throttled down, and threw a line up to the cleat at the base of the ladder. He did it the way he had done it on every previous launch return. He climbed up the ladder. He stepped onto the deck. He looked at me. He said, "Hello." His voice was his voice. His face was his face. He stood in front of me in the gold and gray light, and he looked at me with what looked like Halver's eyes. I said, "Where did you go?" He smiled. The smile was almost his smile. It had a small flatness in it that was not quite right, the way a photograph of a person can be a perfect photograph of that person and still not be the person. He said, "I went down to the south end." He said, "I wanted to see something for myself." He said, "We should keep working the lane. The bottom is fine." He said this last sentence very calmly, looking at me. And as he said it, I felt my hand tighten on the rail behind my back without my having told it to. Antero was standing next to me. He had not moved. He was looking at Halvers in the way a man looks at a piece of machinery that has just begun to do a thing it should not be able to do. Halvers said, "Where is Doust?" I said, "In the wheelhouse." He said, "Good." He said, "I am going to go up, and we are going to bring the cutter back down and finish the lane." He said the company would not be happy if we lost the rest of the contract. He took a step toward the deckhouse. Antero stepped sideways. He stepped between Halvers and the deckhouse door. He did it slowly, not aggressively, with his hands at his sides. He said, "Captain." He said it in his slow, careful English. He said, "Sit down, please." Halvers stopped. He looked at Antero. The flatness in his face deepened, the way water deepens when something below it shifts. He said, "Antero, get out of the way." He said it in Halvers's voice exactly. He said it with a small irritation that was Halvers's irritation when his orders were being slowed by his crew. It was a perfect imitation. It was not Halvers. Antero did not get out of the way. Halvers looked at me. He said, "Tell him to move." I did not tell him to move. I had not known, until that moment, whether I would be the kind of man who told him to move. I had known I had not written the warning in the log. I had known I had not raised the handset on Monday morning. I had known I had bought myself 2 days of silence over breakfast on Tuesday. I had known all of those things about myself, and I had been afraid, on the basis of those things, that I would be the kind of man who told Antero to step aside because the captain was the captain. I was not, in that moment, that kind of man. It is the only thing about the entire contract that I am able, even now, to look at without flinching. I did not tell him to move. I said, "Where is the launch radio?" The thing wearing Halvers's face looked at me. It did not answer. I said, "Where is your handheld?" It did not answer. I said, "Where is the captain?" There was a long pause. The flatness in the face deepened again. The mouth did not move. The eyes did not move. The face stayed pointed at me. the way a face stays pointed when the person behind it is no longer making small adjustments to keep it pointed naturally. After a few seconds, the mouth opened slightly and Halvor's voice came out of it and said, "The captain is on the bottom." Behind me, I heard Deuced come out of the wheelhouse. He had been listening on the bridge intercom, which had a microphone in the cabin doorway. He had heard the whole exchange. He had a flare gun in his hand. He did not point it. He kept it at his side. Halvor's face turned to look at him. The body did not move. Only the head turned. Deuced did not flinch. Deuced said, "Off the boat." The thing wearing Halvor's face looked at him for a long moment. Then it smiled, the small flat smile again. It said, "I am the captain of this vessel." It said this in the same voice it had used at every dinner for 4 weeks. Deuced said, "Off the boat." It did not move. Antero, very quietly, put his hand on its shoulder. It turned then, in a movement that was not quite a step, and went back down the boarding ladder. It went down the ladder the way Halvor's went down the ladder. It got into the launch. It cast off the line. It throttled up. It pulled away from our hull and turned south. It went into the dusk in a straight line. The wake behind it was a clean wake, the way Halvor's wakes had always been. None of us said anything until it was out of sight. Antero was the one who finally spoke. He said it walked on his face. He said it as a description, not as a metaphor. He had a word in his own language he wanted to use for it, he said later. But he could not find the English. He said it had been wearing him for a while. I think about that sentence often. We went back into the cabin. Pell had come up to the cabin door while we had been on deck, and had been standing in the corridor listening. He had heard everything. His face had a stillness on it that I had not seen on a 22-year-old's face before. He did not ask any questions. He went to the chart table and started laying out the emergency equipment from the locker without being asked. The supply boat came in about 20 minutes after that. Mir brought it alongside our port side, opposite where the launch had been, in the careful close quarters way that small boat skippers handle a big hull at idle. He did not tie up. He stood off about 3 meters with his engines holding station. He had a megaphone up to his mouth. He called across the gap. He said, "Get off your boat." Deuced said, "We cannot get off our boat." He said the depth was 14 feet under our keel, and we could not move, and we needed Mur to take us off in stages. Mur said, 14 feet. Deuced said, 14. Mir was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "All right." He said he had room for 4 if we crowded. He said the patrol boat was about 30 minutes out. He said the patrol boat could take all of us and tow the dredge if necessary. He said we should come across to him now and let the patrol boat collect us from his deck. Deuced looked at me. He looked at Antero. He looked at Pell. Pell said, "Take Pell first." Pell said this. The 22-year-old said it. He said it in the small, clear voice he had been using all afternoon. He said it because he had been raised somewhere that had taught him to say it, or because he had read enough books about boats that he knew the order, or because he had been thinking about his mother the whole time we had been on the deck. I do not know which. He said it, and he meant it. Deuced said, "You go first, Pell, but only because you are the youngest, and we have not paid you enough to die on your first contract." He said it lightly, the way a first mate says a thing to a kid to keep him from being scared. Pell let himself be made lighter by it. He went to the rail with his bag. Mur brought the supply boat closer. The 2 hulls did not quite touch. Mur's deckhand held a rope across the gap. Pell stepped down onto our boarding platform and across the gap onto the supply boat's afterdeck. Mur's deckhand caught him by the arm and pulled him in. Pell turned to look back at us. He waved once. Mir pulled back off our hull, throttled gently, came around in a careful arc, and brought the boat back in for the next pass. Antero went next, on Doust's order. He did not argue. He went the way he had done everything for 4 weeks, in his slow, careful way, with no extra movement. He stepped across the gap, and Mir's deckhand caught him too. Mir pulled off again. While Mir was coming back the third time, the depth gauge on the bridge began to climb. I want to be very careful in how I describe this. Doust and I were in the cabin watching the gauge. The number had held at 14 feet for almost 40 minutes. The number now began to rise. 15, 16, 18, 20. The seabed under us was dropping. The platform we had been sitting on was sinking. Doust saw it before I did. He looked at me. He did not say anything. He went to the cabin door and called down to the boarding deck. He called down for me to go. I want to be very careful here too. I'm going to tell you what I did. I went down to the boarding deck. The supply boat was coming back in. Mir had it about 10 meters off, slowing on the approach. Doust was behind me on the ladder. The depth gauge in the cabin behind us, which I could see in my mind's eye more clearly than I could see the supply boat in front of me, was at 25 feet and rising. I crossed the gap. Mir's deckhand caught my arm. I turned around on his deck. I looked back at our hull. Doust was at our rail. He had not come down the ladder. He had stayed at the top. I said, "Doust, come." He said, "I am going to bring her north under her own power." He said, "The patrol boat will tow if she will not run." He said, "I am not going to leave a working vessel on a bottom that is doing this if I can get her off it." I said, "The bottom is dropping." He said, "That is why I'm going to try." Mir said, "Across the gap, son, get off the boat." Doust did not get off the boat. He turned and went back up the ladder to the wheelhouse. We saw him through the cabin window. He went to the engine telegraph. The bow thrusters came on. The pumps engaged. The vessel began to move, very slowly, northward. We pulled away. I want to tell you what I felt when we pulled away. I felt relief. I felt it before I felt anything else. I felt the relief of a man who's been let off a boat that he believes is going down. And I felt it in the front of my chest like a warm thing. And I have spent 11 years trying to understand the shape of that feeling and to put it away somewhere where I cannot reach it. And I have not been able to do either. Doust took the dredge about a half-mile north before the bottom let go of her. We watched it happen from the supply boat. The depth gauge on the supply boat, which Mir had patched into our hull repeater, showed the seabed dropping out from under the dredge at about 40 feet a minute. The dredge began to settle. She did not list. She did not break up. She did not do anything dramatic. She settled evenly into water that should have been 200 feet deep, in the slow, undramatic way that a heavy hull settles when its trim is good and its compartments are sound. We could see Doust in the wheelhouse the whole time. He stayed at the telegraph. He did not come out. He did not raise us on the radio. The water came up the hull at the rate the seabed went down, which is to say that the dredge sank at exactly the speed at which the bottom that had been holding her up withdrew, which is to say that whatever was under her was lowering her, gently, into the depth she had been pulled up from. She went under at about 8 in the evening. The wheelhouse light stayed on under the water for almost a minute after the deck went below. I could see the glow of it through the surface, getting smaller and dimmer, in a perfect, even circle, until it was too far down to see it all. The sea closed over her without a wave. Mir's deckhand, a man I never learned the name of, vomited over the rail. Pell was sitting on the deck with his back against the bulkhead. He had his hands flat on the deck on either side of him. He was looking at me. He had been watching me since I had come aboard. I could not look back at him. I looked at the water where the wheelhouse light had been. Mir did not say anything. He turned the boat north, and he ran for the patrol boat at the full speed his hull would give him. The patrol boat picked us up about 40 minutes later. They put a blanket around each of us. They asked us our names. They asked us what had happened. We told them in fragments, the way you tell things when you have just watched them. The patrol boat's master listened without interrupting. He had a face that had heard many bad things and that had decided, a long time ago, to keep its expression neutral about all of them. When we were done, he made calls on his radio. He told the Coast Guard. He told the company. He told the Port Authority. He told them that the dredge had gone down with one man aboard, and that 3 crew were recovered alive, and that the captain was presumed lost. He said presumed lost. He said it because there was no way to say what had actually happened to Halvers. There is no form for it. There is no line item on a casualty report that fits. We were brought ashore that night. The Coast Guard interviewed us separately at the harbor master's office. I told my interviewer what I had told the rest of the crew in the wheelhouse, about the supply skipper's grandfather and the slope drift and the bands in the clay and my brother's notebook page. The interviewer was a young officer, maybe Pell's age, who took careful notes and who did not look up at me very much. When I was done, he closed his notebook and he thanked me. He said the report would go to the Marine Investigations Branch. He said he would not be making any judgments about the cause of the incident in his interview summary. He said the agency would do that. The agency did do that. The agency did it about 4 months later in a written report that ran to 83 pages. The report concluded that the dredge had been lost due to an unprecedented localized seafloor liquefaction event possibly associated with an undocumented subsurface gas pocket, and that the captain had been lost as a result of an unauthorized solo launch transit during the developing incident, and that the surviving crew had acted appropriately under the circumstances. The report did not mention the supply skipper. It did not mention my brother's notebook. It did not mention the contour drift on Sunday night. It did not mention the photocopy I had read out loud in the wheelhouse. I had submitted all of those things in writing. They were in the appendices. The conclusions did not refer to them. They had been read, considered, and set aside, the way the Port Authority had set aside Mir's warnings about the South Anchorage 2 years before. I read the report once. I have not read it again. Doust's body was never found. The dredge is still on the bottom out there. The company posted a notice to mariners about the wreck, and changed the chart, and went on with its work. The contract was completed by another vessel from another company the following year. The Port Authority did not include the South Anchorage in that contract. I asked through a friend. I was told the section had been declared too irregular to be cost-effective to maintain. That was the phrase they used. Too irregular to be cost-effective to maintain. Pell left the dredging industry. He sent me a card about a year later. He had taken a job at a marine museum in a city I had never been to, where he gave tours and helped maintain the exhibits. He wrote that he was all right. He wrote that he had a girlfriend now. He wrote that he had not been on a boat since the patrol boat and did not think he would be again. He wrote that he thought about Doust often. He did not write that he thought about me. I do not think he wanted to lie. I have kept the card in a drawer in my kitchen. I have not written him back. Antero went home to Finland. He retired. I do not have a way to reach him. He did not give me one. Mayer is still running supply boats out of that same small port town. I have not been back. I have thought about going back. I have thought about sitting across from him on a deck somewhere and telling him that I had heard him on the day he told me about his grandfather, and that I had decided not to listen. And that I knew he had known I had decided not to listen. And that I was sorry. I have thought about it, and I have not done it. I tell myself that he does not need me to come and apologize to him. I tell myself that he performed his small ceremony of warning, and that his obligation ended when he stood up from the table on our deck. I tell myself that going back would be for me and not for him. All of that is true. The truer thing is that I'm afraid to look at him and have him look back. I left dredging. I work in a warehouse now. I drive a forklift on a day shift. I have not been on the water since the patrol boat brought me in, 11 years ago. I have not seen the ocean except once, from a hotel window in a city I was in for a wedding. And I closed the curtain after a few minutes because the surface of the water at that distance looked too much like the surface of the water at our south anchorage on the afternoon Halvers went south in the launch. I keep my brother's photocopy in the inside pocket of a jacket I do not wear anymore. The jacket hangs in my hall closet. Every few months I take the photocopy out and I read it. I read the long entry about Elle, and the line that says you should not return to the area in the same boat, and the line that says you should not go in the water for any reason within a mile of that position, and the note in my brother's handwriting that says he had been going to ask me about it. I read it the way other men read their religious books, not because I expect to learn anything new from it, but because the act of reading it is the only act I have that admits what I did. What I did, in the simplest words I have, is this. I was given a warning by a man who had nothing to gain by giving it. I was given a second warning by my own brother, in his own handwriting, in a letter that arrived in time. I sat on a screen that told me the truth at 2 a.m, with a radio handset in my hand, and I put the handset down. I bought 2 days of silence for myself over a breakfast. In those 2 days, a man I worked with for 4 weeks was, by Antero's word, walked on. In those 2 days, the bottom under our hull came up and held us in place. Long enough that a second man, who had done nothing wrong, chose to go down with his vessel rather than leave her on a seabed he did not understand. I went home. The two of them did not. I have asked myself many times whether I would do it differently if I were back at the table with Mare on that gold afternoon. I would like to tell you that I would. I cannot promise it. The man I was at that table did not refuse the warning out of bravery or out of greed. He refused it out of a small, flat unwillingness to be the kind of man who took such warnings seriously. And I'm not certain that the man I have become since is a different man underneath. I am only certain that I have not been given the same warning twice. That is what I want you to understand about survival, if you are still listening. I am not a survivor of a disaster. I am the man the disaster passed over because he did not put his hand up at the right time. There is a difference. The disaster knows the difference. The disaster, whatever it was, took the captain it could wear, and the first mate it could not bend and let me go because letting me go cost it nothing. I came home because I was not worth the trouble of keeping. I have lived 11 years on the strength of that judgment. My brother's wife remarried 2 years ago. She invited me to the wedding. I went. I stood at the back of the room and I watched her be happy, and I was glad she was happy, and I did not stay long. She came up to me before I left, and she put her hand on my arm, and she said she was glad I had come. She said she still thought about him. She said she hoped I was doing all right. I told her I was. I told her I had quit dredging. I told her I worked in a warehouse now. She nodded. She said she was glad. She said the work I'd been doing had always worried her. She said she had asked him once, a long time ago, to tell me to be careful. And he had told her that I was the careful one in the family. I drove home from the wedding in a rental car. The road went past a stretch of coastline for about 20 minutes. The water was on my right. I kept my eyes on the road. I am the careful one in the family. That is the sentence I think about most, of all the sentences I've collected over the last 11 years. He believed it. She believed it. The supply skipper had to test it across a coffee cup because he did not know me well enough to know whether it was true. I tested it myself, alone, on the South Anchorage, in the early hours of a Monday morning, with a radio handset in my hand and a contour line on a screen that had moved while I was watching. And I found out what I was. I am still finding out. I will be finding out for the rest of my life, in the small ways that a man tests himself in a warehouse on a day shift. With the ocean at a distance he does not measure, in a jacket he does not wear, with a photocopy in the pocket that he reads every few months and puts back. The bottom is still down there. I do not know what it is. I do not need to know what it is. I know only that it was there before any of us. That it was warned about by men whose grandfathers warned them. That it does not like to be cut, and that it let me go. That is the part I cannot get past. It let me go.